I wanted to go through a concept that we'd already covered, which is measuring economic activity. Remember when we do this, what we're trying to do is look at how much a country has produced. We end up producing it as a number, but remember it's the quantity of production that we care the most about. So we have different names for that, which you can see here. When we look at measuring national production, there are many issues of reliability and just is it worth even doing that are brought up. The problems that arise is, first of all, is producing more or less, is that actually important? We'll talk more about evaluating that later on, but is just the amount we produce, is that a meaningful a measurement? So for example, a country that produces only food versus a country that produces only chairs, neither of those two countries will be adequately using their resources to meet their needs. But GDP, GNP, our measurements of output, they're going to be limited and not really show that that country isn't producing what it really needs. So that's what we mean by that. The issue of accuracy is really important. We'll talk about a bit later on, but we'll talk about the idea that certain parts of the economy just don't get measured. They're impossible to measure. So does that mean that the number itself doesn't really matter? These issues through here, these are other problems in measuring accurately, and we'll bring up some of those ideas again later on as we go. Gross domestic product is probably the most commonly used statistic to measure national income. It's the value of all goods and services produced inside of the borders of a country, and that can be a little bit confusing, so let's have a look at a visual. Assume we have two countries, Greenland and Blue Land, and inside of the borders of the country, which we see here, there's 4 factories and they produce 15, 5, 10, and 5. So for GDP, the GDP of Greenland would be 5 and 15 is 20, 35. So that's its GDP because all this production is going on inside of its borders. Blue Land's production would be 35, 40 because all this production, the value of that production is happening inside of its borders. We'll bring back this diagram in a minute to show how GNP is different. When we look at GDP, we realize that it's not a perfect number, therefore we adjust it to try to make it more useful. And I think that's important to understand that there are so many adjustments which kind of gives away the fact that we don't think that GDP on its own is that useful. The word nominal means that it's just the number and we haven't adjusted it at all. When we adjust it based on changes in the value of dollars or whatever currency you're using, we call that number real. So when your parents say to you, oh, well, you know, things used to be much cheaper back in my day, well, that's kind of what they're getting at is that, you know, something that might cost $10 today maybe only cost $2 or $3 50 years ago, therefore the prices have gone up. So we don't want to say that we're producing more just because the value or the cost or the price of things that we sell is higher. Because again, go back to what we really want to measure, how much stuff are we producing? So when we adjust something for real, it's saying, well, we've gotten rid of the changes in prices. You see examples of this all over the place. This is just a screenshot from the CIA World Factbook. So they're saying data are in 2013 US dollars. So they're saying that all these numbers have been adjusted to the value of the US dollar in 2013. Other things that we need to adjust for the size of population, so per capita does that. And then finally, we need to make a PPP adjustment, which is saying, okay, well, we know how much money each person or how much production there is for each person in your country, but how much stuff inside of your country can that money or can that production buy? So this takes out the differences in price from one country to another. So for example, right now I'm in South Africa, and with $100, you can buy a lot more in South Africa than you can in most parts of the United States. So $100 worth of production in the US isn't actually worth the same amount as $100 worth of production in South Africa because it can buy so much more other stuff in South Africa. So, of all the adjustments, this is one of the most widely used ones. So you will often see, when comparing countries, GDP PPP per capita. It's a pretty useful way of comparing one country to the other. It's not perfect. We'll talk about that more later on. Okay, our next most widely used one, and perhaps it's more commonly used, both of these are both very common, is GNI, gross national income. The difference between GNI and GDP is what I'm trying to show on this visual. So here, the GDP of Greenland was 15, 5, 10, that's 35. GNI doesn't care about borders, it cares about who actually owns the factors of production that are doing the producing. So I've shown that with color. So for Greenland, they own still 4 factories, 1, 2, 3, but they also own this factory that exists over in Blue Land. So for GNI, they add up those 4 numbers, and they don't get to count this 5 over here. So it would be 15 and 5, 20, 30, 40. So for Greenland, their GDP is 35, but their GNI is 40. So that one maybe makes them look a little bit better. For Blue Land, their GNI would be 20, 25, 30, 35. So their GNI would be a little bit smaller than their GDP. So they would maybe prefer to use GDP to make themselves look a little bit stronger. All the same adjustments that you might make to GDP, you can make to GNI because, again, they are very similar numbers. So which one's better? Well, like I said, it really comes down to which one is going to make you look better. That's probably going to be the one you want to use. Remember that when you put these numbers out, one of the major functions of them is to display economic strength, and that might be to other countries, like you're trying to make yourself look strong to another country. But more commonly, it's from a political leader saying, look how much I've strengthened the country, so go ahead and vote for me or for my party again. So they're going to use the number that makes themselves look the best. Or vice versa, if you're running against that person, you're probably going to use the number that makes them look the worst. So what we need to look at is how many of the factors of production that exist inside of your borders are owned by you versus how many factories and things like that you own in other countries. So oftentimes countries that have large amounts of foreign multinationals operating inside of them, their GDP is going to look bigger than their GNI. So I gave some examples. So South Africa, for example, where I live, their GDP is 351 billion, but their GNI is 381 billion. So they would prefer to use their GNI. It's going to make them look a little bit bigger. You can see that Iran's GDP is, again, significantly smaller than their GNI, and China's GDP is actually bigger than its GNI. So what that means or the significance of that, I'll let you guys decide. The point is you do get different numbers. Net national product is another way of adjusting the value of a nation's output. Capital is really important because it allows countries to produce more things, faster, more quantity, maybe more quality. Anyhow, capital is viewed as really important for that reason. When your production is only producing capital to fill in for capital that is broken down or out of date, then it's not as if you're really growing in your capacity. So NNP is pretty closely linked to the idea of like the PPC or long run aggregate supply that you'll learn about obviously this unit as well. So anyhow, it's always going to be smaller than GDP or GNI for that reason. The example I gave here, I gave for Germany. So their GNI is 3.2 trillion and their NNI is 2.6. So that means as a ratio, NNI divided by GNI, about 19% of their GNI is going to replace things that have broken down or just aren't useful anymore. It includes infrastructure as well, which is pretty important. For Russia, you see them, that it's some different numbers here, and obviously they're using much less. Their NNI is much closer to their GNI, so they're replacing far fewer things. Again, whether that's good or bad, I'll leave that judgment up to you. But again, the importance is that there is a difference. Green GDP is similar to NNP in that it's trying to measure devaluation of something, but instead of trying to measure the devaluation of capital, it tries to measure the devaluation of maybe the most important capital, and that's the environment. So it just is saying, well, yeah, you produced a lot more this year, but you used up a lot of your natural resources in doing so, so that limits the value of your production. It changes the significance. China pioneered this. It never really caught on. India tried it for a year or two, as did China, but it hasn't really been too popular. I thought this quote was interesting that I got from these guys down here, if you want to go check it out. But basically talking about how they liked the idea of ecological modernization. They saw that as valuable, but the party also was forced to produce more stuff because that's just how the world is built. When you evaluate national output, some problems that are raised is it really is a quantity versus quality dilemma. Is producing more stuff good, or should we be producing more things of higher quality, things that are healthier, things that use the environment better, etc.? It's hard to make meaningful comparisons amongst countries because countries are so different in terms of population, resource endowment, prices inside of countries. All those things are different, so it really limits how useful the numbers are. Using a wide range of statistics is going to help to solve that problem because you can, by using lots of the different numbers that I've given you, you can form a pretty accurate picture of what a country might look like. However, you're never going to get to issues of standard of living, quality of life. Yeah, maybe a country produces more, but maybe they do so by working way too much and they don't have enough time to enjoy their lives. Issues of income and gender equality, of course, those aren't going to be counted in there, and they should be, or at least it's an important part of quality of life, and it's an important part of what makes an economy healthy. And you're never going to see issues about opportunity. You know, what is out there for people? Are they able to, going from having relatively little to making something of themselves and improving the quality of their lives? I'm not going to play this for you here, but there's a good speech, and this is from Robert F. Kennedy, that is really about that last issue, so go have a look. A final issue when evaluating national output is the issue of accuracy. And it's a little bit of a different issue. Those others are kind of more significant, as in, what does it all mean? There is always the issue of, is it even right? Is the number that we produce, how correct is it? So two issues there. One is the issue of unproductive production, quote unquote. We're not saying someone who isn't producing, we're saying someone who is producing, but the production isn't being measured. Like when a mechanic fixes their own car. If fixing my car for me is production, then a mechanic fixing their own car should also be production. But of course, that's not going to get measured. This is really substantial in countries where there's a lot of subsistence farming. It probably doesn't matter in the mechanic example, but it does matter in countries where people are growing and eating their own food. The value of that production is not going to be accurately measured. They might try to estimate it, but obviously there's going to be a lot of problems with that. A second problem is the problem of illegal production. So what may occur on the black market for things that we consider to be illicit or, kind of things that we don't like in society, that's the black market. We use the term parallel market for production that we don't have a problem with it, but it is technically illegal in that it's probably not, regulated, and people probably aren't reporting their income to the government, etc. I'm sorry to put those two together because they're not really the same, but they both fit nicely into the idea of illegal production. So obviously they're not going to get measured, but it is production. Also in that is when people are bartering with each other. And again, this is it's technically illegal. I don't think most people care about it too much. But technically if I produce something and just trade it for something you've produced, that is exchange, but it's probably not going to get measured either.